Going live? Eventually? Oh, we're live. Everybody gets to watch me.
Oh, yeah, sorry. It's on.
I'm gonna move it a little closer because we can. I know. Let's try that. Oh, okay.
Then, do you guys have tablecloths? Like more disposable, or do you just buy it per event? Okay.
I would rather. Only problem is that's the way I can actually.
Ventilation.
The John Show. Yeah.
I think yours is
I mean, you accidentally stayed. I was doing like a joke because actually, and I was like, oh yeah, this is why
On my steps, the risers on the steps, upstairs.
So I had
The risers, yeah. But I put this one down, just the riser. There's color in there.
spread
And that's,
the
you know,
there was
you know,
no training for you.
that's yellow, right? Right.
And then they speak.
I like those kind of ones. I don't know. So that's a market.
This part is very.
Yeah. Now it's like, and then.
So
I wanted to. Yes.
3 years.
I went to.
Yeah, you unless doing this.
Yeah, that's where I got my head.
Yeah, I was also
I gotta find it.
I'm glad you get your water. I was actually.
Oh, cheers. Did you enjoy it? Just kidding.
Yeah.
So how's it night?
Oh, yeah, that was, yeah, I mean, so stuff.
Or think like this one.
Because you got to the area, San Francisco, 2 weeks.
Oh.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
There's more food, there's drinks and water and coffee in there, and stuff and stuff.
He was telling, he said there's a couple of
Just today, there's a race.
Oh, yes.
And like, what is like the most sweeping election? It's like, he's known from a long line of years.
So if I could have your attention, everybody, thank you for being with us during night to celebrate Mardi Gras, but also to gather for the lecture tonight. My name is Father Brian Cool. I'm the director of the Catholic Human Committee here. I want to thank you and our e-board for helping us together, and our campus minister, Jen Hughes, who's back there. Oh, please feel free to move around and get some more food or drinks and make stuff at home. The women's room is off to the right, as well as the men's room off to the left. If you took the stairs down, you may want to take the elevator back up. It's a long way up here for that, okay? But very pleased to have our speaker tonight, and also very pleased to have many people visiting us with us online. Sorry, we had a little problem with our live stream, so we've rigged it up with the laptop here. It's okay because we're moving to a new Catholic center. I don't know if I told you guys that or not, but it's coming up, so we don't need to invest in a new live system that's already being invested in. So I apologize for the quality on the video. I'm trying to make the slides show a little bit better in a second. But so along with that, I just want to introduce to you all, many of you know Father John Mack, who's a retired priest of the Diocese of Buffalo, and a dear friend of ours here at the Newman Community at RIT, and you of our Father John has been a sacramental minister, a professor, a good friend to have around. This idea to bring Angela, our speaker tonight, was born out of Father John, so I thought I'd ask Father John to do the introduction for us. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We are on the threshold of Lent in this Mardi Gras, this Fat Tuesday. And we approach this with a sense of hopefully open hearts and a spirit of conversion as we prepare our Lenten disciplines of prayer and almsgiving and fasting that will accompany us, and hopefully some insights tonight through the writings of Flannery O'Connor. Formally, this is the Judith Johnson O'Brien Women in the Church Endowed Lecture, gifted by Dennis and Judith O'Brien, former president of the university. We are grateful for the continuing support of this lecture series here. We are also grateful to Jack Downey, the John Henry Newman Catholic Studies Chair and co-sponsor of tonight's lecture. Jack knows Angela from her time at Fordham. Unfortunately, he could not be with us this evening, but we are reminded by Jack to encourage you to sign up for his Catholic Studies courses here at University of Rochester. 2026 is the 100th anniversary of this Catholic Southern Gothic writer, her birth from Georgia, Flannery O'Connor. Her stories challenge, they unsettle, and illuminate the workings of grace in unexpected and sometimes dark places. That grace is a fierce grace, which Flannery communicates with startling clarity. As Lent invites us to reflect honestly and humbly on our own spiritual lives, we hope that O'Connor's vision can accompany us on our Lenten journey to Easter. Joining us this evening is a dear lady, Angela Alima O'Donnell, PhD. She is a professor, a poet, a scholar, and writer at Fordham University in New York City. She serves as the Associate Director of Fordham's Curran Center for American Catholic Studies. Her publications include 11 collections of poems, a memoir about caring for her dying mother, Mortal Blessings, a book on the practical theology of Flannery O'Connor, The Province of Joy, a critical biography of Flannery O'Connor, Fiction Fired by Faith, and a book-length study, Radical Ambivalence, Race in Flannery O'Connor. She writes for America Magazine, Commonweal, Church Life Journal of Notre Dame, and other publications devoted to the intersection of faith and art, and the subject of Catholic imagination. She is the founding editor of the book series Studies in the Catholic Imagination, in partnership with Fordham University Press. Her 12th collection of poems, The View from Childhood, New and Selected Poems, will be released this spring. Tonight, Angela will focus on the continuing appeal of Flannery's stories, their strangeness, their use of violence and the grotesque, and how Angela herself has encountered Flannery as a reader and the challenging question of race in O'Connor's writing. She has been a Facebook friend of mine for a number of years. We met in person accidentally at a University of Notre Dame conference when she accidentally sat down across from me at lunch. Please welcome Angela Lamona.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, first, good evening, everyone. It's a delight to be here to celebrate Mardi Gras with you, which is traditionally an evening of feasting and festivity before we enter into the solemn season of Lent. I'm honored to be the Judith Johnson O'Brien Women in the Church lecturer this year, and I'd like to thank the O'Brien family for their generosity in endowing this important lecture series. For, as I hope tonight's lecture will demonstrate, where would the church be without women?
Amen.
Given the prominence of humor, unbridled joy, and the theatrical display of wild, seemingly untamable aspects of human nature characteristic of Mardi Gras, I can't think of a better subject for us to be considering tonight than American Catholic female fiction writer Flannery O'Connor. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you have read O'Connor, know who she is, have some introduction to her work? Okay, great, good to know. By the end of the evening, you will just want to go out and buy her books and read her. Those of you who are familiar with O'Connor and her work are aware O'Connor was whip-smart and funny, outrageous and hilarious, charming and devilishly clever, and she was also dead serious about her faith and the power of her novels and the stories that she wrote to convey the supernatural truths that lie at the heart of her Catholic belief. Flannery's stories are wild. Crazy, unpredictable things happen. When one enters O'Connor's world, one learns to expect the unexpected. In this sense, they are much like life. These slides, by the way, describe a couple of O'Connor's stories. The one with Jesus on the back of anybody know that story? Parker's back, a man who's obsessed with tattoos. The middle one is one from our famous stories, Revelation. Jesus Cares here is her novel, Wise Blood. The one on the lower corner is a wooden leg, a Bible, and some liquor. And that is from her story, Good Country People. So these are all just little drawings that kind of represent O'Connor's stories. O'Connor's stories also have a reputation for being wicked, which I put in quotation marks. They contain some truly despicable as well as some merely dislikable characters. Among them are racists, rapists, fraudulent street preachers, fake Bible salesmen, prostitutes, nymphomaniacs, child molesters, escaped convicts, and serial killers, to name just a few. O'Connor's stories lead us into the dark heart of human nature, where we see its murky workings. Wickedness is her subject over and over again. Yet, I put the word wicked in quotation marks. Though O'Connor's stories depict the grim realities of sin and human brokenness, they are ultimately concerned with the possibilities of grace and redemption. Each of her stories and novels poses the same questions. Is it possible for broken, deeply flawed human beings to recognize and genuinely repent for our egregious behavior towards one another? Is it possible for us to be forgiven? And finally, is there any sin that's beyond God's mercy? All of this sounds very theological and very heady. It is. Flannery was very theological and very heady. But let me hasten to remind us that O'Connor's stories are also profoundly engaging and wildly entertaining. Her humor is savage, but it is also weirdly holy. Like the Mardi Gras parades we see during the carnival season in New Orleans, Mobile, and various Catholic cities in Europe, O'Connor's stories put the strange and bizarre aspects of human nature on display. Not only do we see wicked characters, we also see grotesques, characters who are flawed and broken physically, and whose flaws are the embodiment of their spiritual limitations. O'Connor's stories and novels feature a Mardi Gras parade of misfits, including another list: one-armed men, women with wooden legs, intersex people, folks with cognitive disabilities, mad people, people who dress up and run around town in gorilla costumes, etc. In other words, people who don't easily fit into any preconceived categories. How many people have been to New Orleans, by the way, to Bourbon Street? Oh, okay. So you'll recognize this, this picture. O'Connor much admired the zest and the verve of New Orleans. She once wrote, "If I had to live in a city, I think I would prefer New Orleans to any other, both Southern and Catholic, and with indications that the devil's existence is freely recognized." As her statement suggests, O'Connor believes in the devil, in the forces of darkness that lie inside of us, and also the ones that bedevil us from without. Her goal as a fiction writer is to portray the world as it truly exists, according to her Christian Catholic vision. And while many places in the US deny the existence of the devil and evil as superstition, or they try to explain it away, New Orleans embraces that supernatural reality and holds it up for our consideration. Tonight, the streets of New Orleans are filled with people who look very much like Flannery's characters, the wild, the wicked, and the grotesque. I can vouch for this because I was just in New Orleans in November. I was there to give a talk at Loyola, and I decided to book a hotel in the French Quarter, right on the corner of Toulouse and Bourbon Street. That was perhaps not the smartest choice I ever made in terms of getting any sleep, but it was nonetheless the perfect choice, as it gave me the chance to see the stream of humanity that passed beneath my balcony every night from dusk until 3:30 a.m. There were so-called normal or ordinary-seeming people scattered in among the weirdos as well, but O'Connor also believed that at some level, all of us are misfits. All of us are weirdos. What makes us strange is just a little more obvious in some people's cases than it is in others. In fact, she believed herself to be an oddball, or to use her word, a freak. Flannery's penchant for odd creatures goes back to her childhood in Savannah, Georgia. One of her favorite pastimes as a small child was to raise pet chickens. She particularly liked collecting ones that had strange features, mismatched eyes, and ones that were missing limbs or wings. She kept looking for ones without a head. That didn't happen. She used to sew little costumes for her chickens and dress them up and try to teach them to do tricks. Talk about a Mardi Gras image. She would parade them in the backyard, and she even taught one to walk backwards. This, by the way, led to one of the most important moments in Flannery's life. When she was about 5, the Pathé News Company in New York got wind of a little Southern girl who raised chickens, and they sent a cameraman down to Savannah to capture this small miracle on film. The chicken, unfortunately, refused to cooperate, so the newsman simply ran the film backwards to simulate the chicken's magical gait. You can find this charming video on YouTube, by the way, where you can see little Flannery with her specially gifted and strangely set apart chicken. I first encountered O'Connor's work, and I'm sorry, there are going to be some spoilers here, but it's inevitable. I first encountered O'Connor's work when I was about the age of many of you in the room. I was a sophomore English major. How many sophomores in the room? Sophomore English major. You're all more mature. Okay, yeah, one or two, thank you. I was at a secular state university. At the time I read her story, I didn't know she was a Catholic. We read her signature story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, in a literature course along with other works by celebrated American writers. The plot unfolds with astonishing speed, taking the characters and the readers on the ride of their life. A chatty, bossy old grandma tries to convince her family not to drive to Florida on vacation. There's a serial killer who calls himself a misfit on the loose. Nonetheless, the family goes. Along the journey, she convinces them to leave the main road to see an abandoned plantation house that she recalls from her childhood. Unfortunately, the grandmother misremembers, and instead of the grand mansion from the past, they come face to face with the mass murderer that she so dreaded. The misfit's henchman, the murderer is named the misfit. The misfit henchman takes the family members into the woods one by one and shoots them until only the grandmother is left. She tries to convince the misfit to pray and to mend his ways as he agonizes about his spiritual doubts. And then, in a rare moment of empathy, something extraordinary happens. The grandmother reaches out to comfort him. She refers to him as one of my own babies, whereupon he shoots her 3 times in the chest. The last we see of the grandmother, she is lying in the ditch in a puddle of blood, as you can see from this drawing here, looking up at the sky and smiling. The misfit offers a brief eulogy. She would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. As the story unfolds, it is admittedly hard to watch, but as with a wreck on the side of the road, it is impossible to look away. One of the most disturbing things about this story, and a signature of O'Connor's style, is the commingling of the comedy of everyday life with unspeakable horror. The story is full of humorous details, jokes, and observations, often at the expense of these characters, revealing their foolishness and their vanity. As readers, we find ourselves laughing, in spite of ourselves, even as some of the story's most disturbing events are occurring. As a 19-year-old reader, I had no idea what to make of this story, of the brutal violence perpetrated on a group of ordinary people, which was peppered with jokes at their expense. I thought, is she a ghoul? The characters in O'Connor's story are not terribly likable, so it's hard to feel a great deal of empathy for them. Yet they clearly didn't deserve this awful fate. O'Connor's story shocked us all back then, and as a longtime professor of literature, I can attest that it still shocks students today. They are as unsure as I was about how we are supposed to feel about the story itself or the people in it. A few years later, I encountered O'Connor's work again as a graduate student studying literature at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I learned not only that she was a Catholic, but a Catholic born and raised in the largely Protestant and generally anti-Catholic South. Finding myself living in a southern town, I was witnessing firsthand how rare Catholics were in that part of the world at that time. I had grown up among immigrant Italians, Irish, and Poles in the Northeast, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, for those of you who are interested and know that region. And in that place, everyone I knew was Catholic. So this sensation of not belonging was new to me. For the first time in my life as a Catholic, I was considered foreign and exotic. Like Flannery, I was a stranger in a strange land. Happily, in my new environment, I was able to rediscover Flannery O'Connor as a fellow Catholic in exile, and to re-see her stories, like a good man is hard to find, as the work of an unmistakably Catholic writer. Now, as I viewed the story through the lens of O'Connor's faith, I came to understand it in an entirely new light, to see that O'Connor used violence as a means of waking her smug characters up, who were not living very Christian lives, to the reality of their mortality and their need for conversion. As O'Connor once stated, in my own stories, I have found that violence is strangely capable of returning my characters to reality and preparing them to accept their moment of grace. Their heads are so hard that almost nothing else will do the work. This idea that reality is something to which we must be returned at considerable cost is one which is seldom understood by the casual reader, but it is one which is implicit in the Christian view of the world. The story, then, is not an isolated, meaningless tale of violence, but a universal moral drama, one each of us is implicated in, for we all must eventually come face to face with evil, with illness, with limitation, with suffering, and with death. And how we respond to such challenges can save our souls. For O'Connor, the spiritual stakes are very high, even in what might seem to be the most innocuous circumstances. I also came to understand Flannery's dark humor from a theological perspective. O'Connor's stories reflect a view of life and death that is essentially comic, despite the terrible things that happen in them, in keeping with the story of the Christian comedy of sin and redemption, death and resurrection that we are all participants in. Death is, after all, not the end of life in the Christian Catholic vision. O'Connor is able to see things from a distance in the context of eternity, and often her response to human folly is, like Shakespeare's Puck, "What fools these mortals be." As O'Connor once famously quipped, only when you are secure in your beliefs can you see the comical side of the universe. In her letters and essays, O'Connor expresses her awareness that a secular society has difficulty perceiving the religious vision that is foundational to her fiction. She once wrote, "Most readers think that I am a hillbilly nihilist, whereas I'm actually a hillbilly Thomist," alluding to her favorite saint, Thomas Aquinas. My sojourn in Flannery's native South marked my initiation into these essential truths about Flannery O'Connor and her work. Since those graduate school days, I've come to know and appreciate O'Connor's distinctively Southern Catholic imagination through many years of reading and teaching her work, and also by engaging in several projects, each of which has enabled me to get to know her in a distinctive and in a different way. A few years ago, I was invited by the Liturgical Press to write a biography of O'Connor that would explore her twin vocations as both a writer and a Catholic. The book I wrote, entitled Flannery O'Connor, Fiction Fired by Faith, gave me the chance to think about Flannery as a private person and a young artist rather than as a famous writer, enabling me to trace the simultaneous development of both her faith and her art. And the story of her life is an interesting one. I love this picture of Flannery where she looks like she's really angry as she's reading a book. She used to do reviews of the books that she had in the house. If you go to her childhood home in Savannah, there's a copy of Alice in Wonderland. At the beginning, opening page, it says, "Not a very good book." And then she signs her initials MFOC, Mary Flannery O'Connor. So she was always a very tough critic. But she was born in Savannah, March 25th, 1925, the Feast of the Annunciation, and christened Mary Flannery O'Connor by her parents, Regina Klein and Edward F. O'Connor, both observant Catholics. She would later drop the Mary and use her middle name instead as a more fitting and memorable name for a writer. She said that Mary O'Connor sounded like an Irish washerwoman, not a novelist. Mary Flannery grew up as an only child under their watchful eye in the fashionable section of the Irish Catholic ghetto of Savannah. Many people been to Savannah. Beautiful city, very French. It's got the French squares. It's lovely. She attended parochial school and was educated by the Sisters of Mercy. However, her Catholic education was an experience she did not particularly enjoy. Mary Flannery didn't quite fit in with the demure Southern schoolgirls of Savannah. In addition, she didn't care much for the nuns who taught her, many of which were very young, as she put it, just off the boat, from Ireland, and she was cleverer than many of them, and she knew it. Flannery's besetting sin is intellectual pride, even when she's 5. Young Flannery's resistance to traditional education was an early sign of her nonconformity, her radically original view of the world, and her self-described identity as a freak. For instance, she refused to learn how to spell, a habit which persisted into her adulthood. She would refer to herself hereafter as an innocent speller. In the writing that was required of her, she would insist upon writing about birds, chickens and ducks particularly. This obsession with birds marked her in the nun's eyes as a child who wasn't very bright. It would remain with her throughout her life, leading eventually to her extravagant collection of over 40 peacocks that she had on her farm when she was an adult. She also had a hard time believing some of the things that the good sisters taught her. For example, she was irritated by the idea of guardian angels. The idea that she was being followed around by some invisible angel all the time creeped her out. As Flannery put it in one of her letters, I developed anti-angel aggression, and it became my habit to seclude myself in a locked room every so often and with a fierce and evil face, whirl around in a circle with my fists knotted, socking that angel. My dislike of him was poisonous. I'm sure I even kicked him and landed on the floor. You couldn't hurt an angel, but I would have been happy to know that I had dirtied his feathers. Like I said, Flannery was an oddball. When Flannery was an adolescent, the family moved to Milledgeville, Georgia, about an hour and 15 minutes from Atlanta, where most of her mother's large Catholic family, the Kleins, lived. Catholics in rural Georgia at the time, 1938, were rare, and among the few Catholic families there, the Kleins were unusually prosperous, thus setting them apart from their southern neighbors. This, in addition to Flannery's identity as an only child, marked her out for a solitary childhood and a semi-solitary adolescence, one she spent among affectionate, attentive adults. Flannery always preferred the company of adults over children. Her reasonably happy childhood, however, came to an end suddenly at age 15 when her father, whom she adored, died from lupus, a hereditary disease which would eventually afflict Flannery and cause her premature death at 39. The death of her father affected Flannery very profoundly. As she wrote in a journal she was keeping at the time, quote, "The reality of death has come upon us, and the consciousness of the power of God has broken our complacency like a bullet in the side." Note the violence of the language 15-year-old Flannery uses here, like a bullet in the side. She also wrote years later that, as a Catholic, death has always been brother to my imagination. And those of us who were raised Catholic know this. The crucifix is something that hangs in everybody's room as children, right? If you go to the Flannery O'Connor childhood home, which I hope you do someday in Savannah, her little crib is in her parents' room, and out the window is St. John the Baptist Cathedral. She could see as a baby the cathedral spires, and then also the hanging figure of the dying Jesus on the cross. So death is something that even babies think about as Catholics. So yes, death was always brother to her imagination. In keeping with our Mardi Gras and our Lenten theme this evening, Flannery's awareness of the reality of death as a real presence in her life became palpable. Just as in the Mardi Gras parades, we see people carrying sugar skulls and figures dressed up as death walking among the revelers, death became a presence in Flannery's stories, a reality that breaks open the consciousness of her characters, like she says, like a bullet in the side. After her father's passing, O'Connor remained in Milledgeville, close to family, attending Georgia State College for Women, where she earned a bachelor's degree in social sciences. After her graduation, the world opened up for O'Connor when she went to graduate school at the Iowa Writers Workshop. Most people are familiar with that terrific program, foundational program for young writers. And that changed her life. She encountered influential writers who would admire her work and help to promote her. As a result of these connections, O'Connor would move to New York City, the center of the writing and publishing world at the time, and she would take up residence in Connecticut with poet, translator, and scholar Robert Fitzgerald, a great translator of Homer, and his wife, Sally. They were Catholic literary friends who helped Flannery in her work and became really lifelong supporters of her work. They offered fellowship and friendship that would last the rest of her life, and they would then edit and publish O'Connor's letters and her essays after her death. So she's achieved the ideal, right? She's 25 years old. She's finished her first novel. She has a publisher. She's living in New York City. It seems as though Flannery is ready for a career as a successful writer. And then she gets this disastrous diagnosis of lupus when she's 25 years old, which is probably the age of many of you in the room, if you're not even younger than that. She's sent back to rural Georgia. She has to go back to the family farm that she knew as a child, which bears the exotic name Andalusia. And she has to go back to a state of childlike dependency as she would live with her mother, Regina, for the rest of her life, who would take care of her in her debilitating sickness. It was during this 13-year exile, she would only live 13 more years after this, that she would write most of the 31 stories, 2 completed novels, and hundreds of letters and reviews that would eventually make her famous. We were just talking over dinner about the fact that O'Connor, unlike people like William Faulkner, did not write a lot. And one of the reasons for that is, well, she died at 39, but also the lupus prevented her from being able to work more than 2 hours a day. And she was also an inveterate reviser, and so she would write something one day and then she'd go the next day and she'd tear it apart and she'd write it again, which is one of the reasons that Flannery's stories are so perfectly crafted. There's nothing wasted because of this attentiveness to her writing. But as a result, you could read all of Flannery O'Connor in a month. Summer, July, read all of Flannery O'Connor. And it's a very powerful experience. She also wrote these words during this time when she was in her exile. There won't be any biographies of me for one reason. Lives spent between the house and the chicken yard do not make for exciting copy. From her vantage point, her life was as ordinary as a loaf of bread, as O.E. Parker in her story Parker's Back says. This statement is surely an expression of O'Connor's humility and perhaps a manifestation of her disappointment. She saw little in her life that would lead to fame or fortune, so she had to content herself with obscurity, or so she thought. O'Connor's earthly pilgrimage was brief and poignant. We are moved by her life, by her death, and by the particulars of her journey, in part because through her stories, and especially through her letters, we get to know her extraordinarily well. During the time when O'Connor was living in Andalusia, walking back and forth from the house to the chicken yard, she was corresponding with friends and fellow writers, publishers, readers, and fans of her work, some very famous people who wrote to her as well. She was a very generous correspondent. She would write to anybody who wrote to her. Reading these letters collected in this volume, The Habit of Being, and this is by no means all of the letters, it's just one particular collection that was made by her friend Sally Fitzgerald after her death. We become eavesdroppers, overhearing stories of every kind, ranging from her delight in the peacocks that she raises, to her annoyance at her annoying mother, to her pleasure at meeting a quirky couple in the doctor's office who inspires some of her own characters. We hear about her steely disapproval or suggestions made by an incompetent editor. One of my favorite early quotations from Flannery is when she's dealing with an editor in New York, and she says, "I wish he would treat me like a clueless campfire girl." And so even when she's 25 years old, O'Connor knew she was good. She was absolutely convinced of her genius. I wish I was convinced of that when I was 25 years old. We all could take a page out of her book. But these letters, we really see O'Connor at, the person that she is and her humor. And also we see how smart she is. She's a kind of a self-taught autodidact when it comes to philosophy and theology. She's reading all of these theological texts, commenting on them, and she's also getting people who are writing her who want to convert to Catholicism. She's acting really as a spiritual director for these people. So again, incredible generosity on her part towards her correspondence. We also bear witness to O'Connor's courage, her gratitude, and her humor, and her irrepressible grace in the face of this disease that is slowly and inexorably ravaging her body. By the time death arrives on August 3rd, 1964, the reader feels very much as if he or she has lost a friend and a fellow traveling companion along the pilgrimage of life. So I highly recommend reading Flannery's letters as well as her stories. This brings me to what is perhaps the most challenging project that I engaged in involving O'Connor. My book, Radical Ambivalence, Race and Flannery O'Connor, published in 2020. A few years ago, I began an inquiry into the issue of O'Connor and race because I felt as if there was more going on beneath the surface of her stories than I was able to see with the knowledge that I had. I needed to know more about her backstory, namely O'Connor's thoughts about African Americans, Jim Crow, integration, and the civil rights movement. I also needed to know more about the ways in which the Catholic Church either helped or hindered the cause of integration in the South and how it might have influenced Flannery's thinking. Most important of all, I needed to equip myself better for the conversations I was having with my students in the classroom, many of whom were sensitized to O'Connor's depiction of African Americans and her explorations of race and racism in ways that students I had taught years ago had not been. So I had all sorts of reasons for wanting to do this research. So I set out on this quest to know more. And as we know from Eden onward, eating of the tree of knowledge doesn't necessarily bring one pleasure or happiness. I visited the archives at Georgia College in Milledgeville and Rose Library in Emory, Atlanta. I read Flannery's private letters, many of which had never been published before. In a number of them, she made confessions and expressed disturbing ideas pertaining to race, African Americans, and civil rights that are not included in The Habit of Being, the collection of O'Connor's letters. And honestly, the contents of them shocked me. The argument of my book, Radical Ambivalence, might be summed up this way. In her private correspondence, Flannery O'Connor admits to being of two minds about the racial issues that dominate her region and her era. In her letters, she is painfully honest in expressing her inherited cultural racism, dominant among white people of the time. While in her fiction, she militates against racism and white privilege, exposing the evils and the soul-destroying power of these sins in her characters, as well as the social structures that deny the humanity of African Americans. O'Connor's Catholic formation was both a help and a hindrance as she struggled with her conflicting attitudes towards race and African Americans. This photo, by the way, I love this photo. This is, of course, one of the civil rights movements, and we see one of the civil rights marches during the movement We see lots of priests and lots of nuns participating. This was not Catholics did not really participate in the early marches. They were actually advised by their bishops not to. This was before Vatican II, and so it was like the church was not in the modern world, engaged in the modern world yet. It was really not until after the Bloody Sunday at Selma that Martin Luther King called for clergy to please participate, priests and nuns, as well as, of course, all the Baptists and other Southern evangelicals were participating. And they came out in force, because this is something that lots of Catholics wanted to do, but they were not permitted to do. So the church itself was rather conflicted about how to handle the business of civil rights and race, particularly in the South, where Jim Crow, of course, reigned. So she had been taught, her Catholic faith had taught her the Imago Dei. She knew that all human beings were beloved by God. But as a Southern Catholic, she was formed by an institution which practiced segregation and did not treat African Americans as equal members of the church. O'Connor would never have attended Mass with African Americans. She would never have been taught by a Black nun or received communion in the hands of a Black priest. The church she belonged to was a white church and a slow church, reluctant to heed the statement of its own bishops made in 1958, condemning the segregation of Catholic schools and churches throughout the country, but especially in the South. All of this imprinted Flannery. Her church treated African Americans as second-class citizens, and O'Connor internalized this from a young age. O'Connor's fiction is the proving ground wherein she struggles with this ambivalence. As she wrote in one of her letters, quote, "I hope to be of two minds about some things is not to be neutral." In her stories, her double-mindedness, these various ways of thinking about race play out and come into sometimes violent conflict, leading the writer and reader to an understanding of the human that transcends time and circumstance, lifting our gaze from the practical to the prophetic. The story in which O'Connor embodies, and this is a picture for those who can't see this, we're on zooming in, is a pig wearing lipstick and glasses and pearls, because pigs are very important to the story Revelation as a kind of image of human nature, fallen human nature, unredeemed human nature. And the main character in the story, Ruby Turpin, is an example of unredeemed human nature. This is a nice grotesque image. The story in which O'Connor embodies her views on the destructive sin of racism most clearly is one of the last stories she wrote, Revelation. Has anybody read that story? Know that story? Okay, great. This is a story about Ruby Turpin, and she is a model of radical ambivalence. She fancies herself a good evangelical Christian woman. She loves Jesus with all her heart, and she tries to do the right thing. But she is a thoroughgoing racist. She despises poor people and the afflicted, and is a self-satisfied sinner who has no inkling of her sins or her spiritual peril. Enter Mary Grace, a homely young woman who is afflicted by some form of mental illness, who happens to be in the doctor's office when Ruby Turpin visits. Mary Grace has been to college in the North, has become enlightened by progressive liberal ideas about race, and she can't stomach Ruby's racist chatter. So in a fit of rage, she flings a book across the room at Mrs. Turpin, hits her in the eye, just above her eye, and tells her to go back to hell where you came from, you old warthog. Mrs. Turpin is stricken, not only physically, but spiritually, by this allegation that she belongs in hell. The heart of the story comes after the violent conflict, which is very typical of O'Connor. Needs that violent conflict, right, to wake this person up. Mrs. Turpin tries to come to terms with this message that she believes has been sent to her by God. As a good Christian woman, she has no doubt that God would speak to her in the doctor's office through the most unlikely of mouthpieces. And the fact that the agent of grace is named Mary Grace makes her role as an annunciating angel unmistakable. So Mrs. Turpin is at first puzzled, but then she becomes enraged at God for daring to send her a message that is so demeaning. She marches out to the farm, and as she's doing her chores, hosing down the pigs, taking care of them, and she calls God out on the carpet repeatedly, screaming and shaking her fists at him, bellowing at the sky, "Who do you think you are?" Those are the last words Mrs. Turpin speaks in the story. Shortly afterwards, God answers, as he often does in O'Connor's stories, but not with words. Instead, she is overwhelmed by three visions that the God she has conjured offers her. The first of the visions reminds her of the fragility of life, hers and all of those that she loves. She imagined her husband in a terrible truck accident and his brains are scattered all over the road. The second vision enables her to see the mystery of creation, the miraculous fact that all life on this earth is beloved and divine. Even the pigs she is taking care of at this very moment, they seem to pant with a secret life. The third vision is the one that affects her most. A purple bridge arches across the sky on which, quote, and this is O'Connor's writing, a vast horde of souls were rumbling towards heaven. There were whole companies of white trash, clean for the first time in their lives, and bands of black Edwards in white robes, and battalions of freaks and lunatics shouting and clapping and leaping like frogs. And bringing up the end of the procession was a tribe of people whom she recognized at once as those who, like herself and Claude, had always had a little of everything and the God-given wit to use it right. She leaned forward to observe them closer. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they had always been for good order and common sense and respectable behavior. They alone were on key. Yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. The souls in the front are those who Ruby has most maligned and despised, black people, lunatics, and so-called white trash. And the souls at the back are the ones like herself and her husband Claude, decent people who have always tried and always failed to do the right thing. It is a Mardi Gras parade, if ever there was one, as well as the purgatorial vision. For Ruby Turpin, this is a salvific moment, for she is walking a path of destruction. It is a beatific vision. The Beatitudes come to life. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first, offering her a glimpse of her fellow human beings as God sees them, as God sees us. Her former bigotries and prejudices fall away as she witnesses the wideness of God's mercy, his love for those who are supposedly the least, and her good fortune to be included in the procession, however inauspicious her place in the parade might be. O'Connor's ability to move in the course of a few pages from the dailiness of the doctor's office to the prophetic vision made manifest to Ruby Turpin as she hoses down the pigs in her pig parlor is an instance of Flannery's prophetic vision in action. Along the way, there are many discoveries, the chief of which is Mrs. Turpin's discovery that she can be both a human being beloved of God and also a wretch, a woman who aspires to holiness, but also a sinner so mired in her old sin she can't see it. At one point, she says to God, shaking her fist, "How can I be a hog and be both?" And of course, she is. We all are hogs, as well as us beloved by God. Stories like Revelation demonstrate O'Connor's desire to reveal the ugly face and destructive nature of racism to her readers. And yet, O'Connor's unpublished letters reveal her own residual cultural racism. Faced with my growing understanding of O'Connor's complicated attitude towards race, her radical ambivalence about the great subject of her era, I knew I had to make it public, though I knew that the discoveries I made in my research that so troubled me were also going to trouble other people. No one wants to discover the flaws in the personality and moral makeup of a person they have come to love and admire. But once we discover their imperfections and their besetting sins, we need to figure out how to live with the knowledge of them. Do we renounce these people? Do we forgive them, no questions asked? Do we excuse them? Or do we do something in between? Continue to love and admire them, but with a more complex and informed love. One thing is clear. It is necessary for readers to acknowledge that O'Connor was no paragon of virtue and certainly no saint, despite the fact that a number of her admirers have tried to claim otherwise. She was an ordinary person, like the rest of us, subject to the culture we are born into and the shaping influences of people around us. Furthermore, she was well aware of her own flaws, as evidenced in her letters and essays. These discoveries I unearthed in the archives inevitably brought me to the central question: is it possible for a person to think racist thoughts and simultaneously to write stories that critique and expose the evils of racism? And my answer to that question was and is yes. It's obvious. She does it. In fact, as I argue in the book, who can write about racist characters better than a writer who suffers from the sin of racism? She knows it from the inside. This particular slide, it's important to note that as she moves forward in time, it's evident in O'Connor's letters that her understanding of the concept of race is deepening in her stories, but also she's becoming more nuanced in her portrayal of the interactions of African Americans and whites. In response to witnessing the heady days of the civil rights movement, O'Connor had embarked on a journey of discovery in which she was reading theoretical and historical books about race, even on her deathbed, in an attempt to come to terms with the great question of her age, including this groundbreaking study of race, the history of an idea in America, by her friend and professor at Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, Thomas Gossett. She writes a letter to Thomas Gossett. I think she writes it in May, saying, I'm reading the book. It's so interesting. And she's dead by August 3rd. So, this is how she's spending her last days, trying to come to terms with an understanding of what race is. It is also important to remember that O'Connor died in August of 1964, just as the first Civil Rights Act was being signed. She was only 39, and I have no doubt that had she lived through the tumultuous years to come, she would have come to a higher and better understanding of the terrible history of race in America and the ways in which that dreadful legacy ought to be dealt with. In Radical Ambivalence, I make no excuses for O'Connor. To the contrary, my aim is to explore the complexity of Flannery's thinking, and by extension, the thinking of many white people about the issue of race in America, the double-mindedness of 21st century white Americans who want to be fair-minded and free of racial prejudice, but who are prejudiced, nonetheless, due to the racism baked into our institutions and into our history. The reason for the persistence of O'Connor's work, despite all the controversy over race, is the prophetic power of her fiction. O'Connor's stories about race and about the human condition take us to a dark place, hold a mirror up to our society and ourselves, and force us to see what we would rather not. That despite the sacrifices of the civil rights movement, despite the gains we have made in creating a more just and equitable society, racism still afflicts our country and still has a place in the American psyche and in our institutions. This is not news to us. All we have to do is look around and see what is happening in our country right now. Flannery saw this is what prophets do. They see ahead. Things go underground, but they come up again, right? It is a message most people don't want to hear, but that is precisely the kind of message that prophets proclaim. O'Connor makes our racial sins manifest as well as her own, demonstrating how far we have to go before the arrival of the Perugia. Flannery O'Connor may not have been a saint, but she was certainly a prophet. Her stories demonstrate that the power of the human imagination is greater than the limitations of our personal prejudices that we inherit from our society. In fact, the imagination helps to free us from those prejudices, just as her stories help her to free her and to free all of us who read them. It is for this reason Flannery's stories continue to haunt us long after we close the book. She takes us to dark places, places where the devil roams freely, both within and without, just as the season of Lent we are about to embark on takes us to dark places. We are all participants in the Mardi Gras parade of sinners and saints that pass through her stories. We are all pilgrims along the Lenten journey. And as with Lent, no matter how dark the journey, we also know that we are simultaneously traveling towards the light. Thank you. Just show a quick film, a little bit from the film. How many of you have seen the film Wildcat, made by Ethan Hawke about Flannery O'Connor's life? Oh, one person. Well, it is a lovely film. And Ethan Hawke made this film almost 3 years ago, 2 years ago. Let's see if I can actually pull it out. This is really great. Oh, that's me in the Pope. That's one of the great moments of my life. Yeah, I so miss him. He's my personal friend. Okay. So let me just say a couple words about this film. The reason it got made is because Maya, most of you might know Maya Hawke, Ethan Hawke's daughter, she fell in love with Flannery O'Connor's prayer journal that she wrote when she was at Iowa. And Flannery's prayer journal is a sweet series of letters when she writes letters to God. She's afraid she's going to lose her faith. It's the first time she's away from her Catholic family. She says, I'm subject to all sorts of intellectual quackery. You have to save me. But mainly her letters are about the fact that she doesn't really know if she's cut out to be a writer. She says, please God, send me a good story. So Maya Hawke, young Maya Hawke, the daughter of Ethan and Uma, Hollywood royalty, right, finds this book and realizes that these letters are articulating her own doubts about her own vocation. So she studies the journal, she learns the journal. Instead of reciting Shakespeare when she goes to Juilliard, she recites O'Connor's letters. And then she says to her father, I want to make a movie about Flannery O'Connor. I want to play Flannery O'Connor. And Ethan says, okay, I will do that for you. So it's a lovely father-daughter project. And what's interesting about the film, there's lots of things that are interesting about it. It's not your usual biopic. It just gives you like one little like snapshot of Flannery's life just as she's coming into her own as a writer and just as she's diagnosed with lupus. So she's like 23 to 25. And she and it intersperses, this is what's brilliant about it, it intersperses moments from the stories into the narrative of her life. So what you'll see in this clip is, episodes where there's Flannery, but then you'll also see the stories being enacted. And it's only a 2-minute clip, but I thought it might give us a taste of the time during which Flannery lived and some of the wildness, zaniness of her sense of humor and her stories.
The sky was underpinned with long silver streaks that looked like scaffolding, but no one was paying any attention to the sky.
Well, I don't understand why you don't want to write something that people would like to read.
Dear God, I want to write a novel, a good novel.
Miss O'Connor, sometimes I feel like you're trying to stick pins in your readers. I don't think you need to make them suffer in order to introduce them to the unusual way your mind works.
Mary Flannery, you've been writing any cute stories lately? I read that last one you sent your mama. It left kind of a bad taste in my mouth.
Well, you weren't supposed to either.
You might want to consider being a little more friendly.
I tried to turn the other cheek, but my tongue was always in it. I need to be working.
Rest. Nowadays, doctors don't let young people die.
Dear God, please. I can never seem to escape myself unless I'm writing. Strangely, I'm never more myself than when I'm writing. Is there no way for me to disappear into something bigger? Lord, please grant me grace. Let me be your typewriter. Please give me one good story. I thought it would be the end of any creation. Now I see it as only the beginning.
It must come easy for you.
It's like giving birth to a piano sideways.
So yeah, we're happy to open it up for questions.
Yes. Let's, I'm gonna start with one and then we'll open it up. Right here. So, first of all, there's a lot. It's a lot, and she obviously wrote from the midst of the context of her life, even though it was short. So, but there's still some type of a relevance. So maybe address the fact, what is the relevance from these stories that are over a century or over half a century and what they speak to us today?
Great, thank you for that question. Well, if we were even just talking about the race thing, obviously these stories about race are just so much in our moment. The kinds of conversations people are having are the kinds of conversations that we're having right now in our own culture. But always, O'Connor, again, has this ability to see prophetically. She's always, so even though her stories are set very firmly in the South, in the middle of the 20th century, and they speak in dialect, they speak this, so they're very, very local. But all the best art is always local and universal at the same time. I think it's amazing that O'Connor is becoming very popular in places like Italy, Poland, Spain, Brazil, Portugal, that she's being translated into all of these various languages. People are, and I can't imagine how they translate Flannery into Portuguese. What do you do, with this very distinctive Southern dialect? But there's something about these stories that speak to people. The fact that Ethan Hawke felt like in 2023, we need to make a movie about Flannery O'Connor. He too was obsessed with her from the time that he was a young man, so he was happy to oblige his daughter. Bruce Springsteen, as some of you may know, was very influenced by O'Connor, especially during a time. How many people saw the Deliver Me from Nowhere film that came out in October about Bruce? Oh, y'all gotta catch up on the movies. So good. It captures Bruce at a moment before he becomes an international superstar. He's poised at that moment, but he is obsessed with making this album, a very acoustic, low-key album called Nebraska. And what makes him want to do this is he becomes obsessed with this serial killer in Nebraska, which is featured in the movie Badlands, which I hope you may have seen. And he's reading Flannery O'Connor's stories. And he says there's something about O'Connor's stories. She gets at a kind of darkness. She gets at a kind of sin. She gets at a kind of aspect of redemption. Of course, Bruce grew up Catholic in Freehold, New Jersey, and he recognizes in O'Connor a fellow Catholic writer. So much of his music, not only in the album, Nebraska album, but after that, is influenced by O'Connor. We have people who are writing plays that are based on O'Connor's. I was going to bring this up at the table we were speaking earlier, that are being performed in New York, based on Everything That Rises Must Converge and her story Revelation. So there is this. Bono has a song about the misfit. He's fascinated by that particular story. It shows up in a lot of pop culture. Like, she just keeps on popping up. So it's pretty clear that she is speaking to people in ways that writers who are forever, like Dante. I mean, there's a great Dante scholar in the room. O'Connor loved Dante, and Dante still 700 years later. Like, it's hard to get anything better than Dante, right? And I think Flannery's. I don't know. I'm sorry, Dante, if I put her in the same category as you, but I think she is going to be one of those writers that survives the ages because of the power of what it is that she has tapped into, this prophetic vision that she has. So I think these are just, I don't know, this answers your question.
Thoroughly.
Thoroughly.
We have some time for a few more questions, so just raise your hand and speak up so everybody can hear you.
I was struck by this notion of the grotesque in Flannery O'Connor, and I was also struck by our conversation of how Flannery is kind of informed by the pre-modern. And in your example, I couldn't help but thinking of this sort of creativity that, especially in medieval drama, was explored with Christ's body, trying to stretch him to make sure he fits on the cross. And I'm just wondering, I guess, in Flannery's case, how does her idea of the grotesque inform or, I guess, arouse modern devotion?
Arouse modern devotion.
Modern devotion in a Catholic circle.
Yeah. Well, actually, she horrifies a lot of Catholics because she is pre-modern, And I have read O'Connor in, he used to have it was a very unfortunately named. It was the St. Francis of Assisi Adult Book Club, which differentiated from the Children's Book Club. We were not reading adult books, but we read we read Thomas Burton, we read Dorothy Day, and then we read Flannery, and a good number of my charming, lovely, good Catholic friends were just horrified. This is a Catholic person, this is a Catholic vision. And I think it is because she is more at home in the medieval universe than she is in the modern. And this is why she loves Dante. She totally gets Dante. And that's one of the reasons I think people are fascinated, who would have no religious sensibility whatsoever, are fascinated by her. As she said, they think I'm a hillbilly nihilist. They think I don't believe in anything, and they don't realize, because they don't understand the medieval mindset that I'm kind of tapping into. There are a number of Catholics who find her troubling, but she doesn't care. She basically says, I'm not for everybody. If you don't like it, don't read it. Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's a good question.
Over here.
Yes.
Do any of the stories have a happy ending or no?
Well, I think Revelation is a happy ending because at the end, Mrs. Turpin gets the vision and she goes back to the last paragraph. She's walking back to the house and she hears the cricket choruses coming up, and she thinks that they're all shouting hallelujah. And so like she gets a second chance, unlike the grandmother who gets shot dead. Just before she's shot though, she gets a glimpse of the kind of woman she should have been all her life and is redeemed in that last moment. So in Flannery's theological sense, they are all happy endings because the grandmother she could have died a terrible death, where she just remained stupid and sinful. But she dies a death where she actually was able to see and experience love, maybe for the first time in her life. But Mrs. Turbin's is definitely a better happy ending because she has the opportunity now, whether she'll take it or not, to live a life as a good woman rather than the racist, hater that she's been up until now. So yeah, that's a great question. And I think that for O'Connor, a happy ending is an ending whenever there's somebody who comes to an understanding of their flaws and their weaknesses, and that gives you a chance at a new life. Yeah, but that's a great question. And this is why the question and the idea of tragedy and comedy are so thoroughly entwined with her. And it's the same thing with any great writer, with Shakespeare. Like there's always hilarious, funny moments in Shakespeare's tragedies and very, very sad moments in his comedies. You really can't separate them. Wise writers do this. They know that they're connected to each other.
Other questions? Yes.
I'll stand up so everyone can hear me. You told us how she was devastated when her father died as a result of the lupus. And then she's 25 when she gets diagnosed with it. In your research, did you see any evolution in how she dealt with the disease and how that informed her faith, and how it was interwoven with that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And this film does a good job for portraying this. When Flannery first got sick, her mother didn't tell her she had lupus because she was trying to protect her, and lupus was a death sentence at the time. So she thought, I tell her she has arthritis, and that we're going to treat that. And then finally, her friend Sally Fitzgerald, who she knew from Connecticut, who collected her letters, Sally said, Flannery, you don't have arthritis, you have lupus. And Flannery's response was, well, thank you for telling me that. That's not good news. But I thought I had lupus and I thought I was crazy. But I'd rather have lupus than be crazy. So again, she had this extraordinary ability to, we could call it stoicism, I guess, this ability to understand that life is the cross. And she understood that this is my cross. This is what I'm going to have to live with. It definitely lit a fire under her. She knew she didn't know how much time she was going to have. They could keep you alive for a while, but it's not like she was going to live to a ripe old age. And so she felt like she was under the gun to be able to write as much as she could and to write as well as she could. Another episode from Flannery's life is her Aunt Katie insisted that she go to Lourdes. And she paid for the trip. So Flannery couldn't say no. And Flannery, she thought Lourdes was superstition. She thought that kind of stuff. She didn't believe in it. But she said, all right, I got to do it because she's making me do this. So she went on this trip to Europe, which she hated. She came back and she said, I'm thoroughly convinced that I'm never going to leave this place again. I'm cured of the desire to travel. She didn't meet the Pope, so she liked that. That's something Flannery and I have in common. Not the same thing, but she, after she got back, she said, I'm starting to feel a little better. Maybe it was something to Lourdes. Maybe it worked. But then she quickly declined after that. So she says these very powerful things about being sick. She says sickness is like a country that you visit. It's more instructive than any trip to Europe. And it's a place that no one can go with you. And she learned so much from her illness, from the everyday knowledge of her mortality, which, let's face it, most of us when we're 25 years old, we really don't believe we're going to die. We think that happens to other people. That doesn't happen to us. Where she was like, oh no, you're definitely going to die. And you're probably going to have a wasting, debilitating. She watched her father waste away, and she knew exactly what was coming. But she's so funny in the letters, like I was just quoting her letter where her last operation, which is what which brings the lupus back, because it goes into remission, and it was in remission for a while, but she had this benign tumor that was growing, and the doctor said she had to have it out. He said, she writes in a letter, well, the doctor tells me if they don't remove this tumor, pretty soon they're going to have to remove me. So she has this kind of stiff upper lip, good humor when she's writing about her death in the letters, or seeing it. But there's also this poignancy, to these letters.
Could I just ask a follow-up? Anything on her, like, her final days? Did she come to some great understanding or make some great statement at some way? She knew she was at the very end of her life.
She had so many in and out of the hospital with, sicknesses. And I'm not even sure that she knew that the last one was the last one. She wrote some of her best stories. She had a book coming out and she wanted to finish the stories in the book. That was her, like, I have to finish these stories. And Revelation was one of them. Parker's Back was another one, and another story called Judgment Day. She wasn't supposed to be working. She would hide under her stuff under the pillow so the nurses couldn't see what she was working on, and she would write. So, and she was actually telling her publisher, Robert Giroux, like, I have to finish this before I die. So she died with her boots on. She absolutely had, the eyes on the prize, and the eyes on the prize was the work. That was what was going to redeem her life. And then she got really sick. She went to the hospital and slipped into a coma and died. So I do love, though, the fact that she was reading Tom Gossett's book about race in May. And she tells him, and Tom Gossett, by the way, got dismissed from the Wesleyan faculty in Macon, Georgia for writing that book because it was so controversial in terms of his ideas about race are very much the ideas that we talk about now. Race is it's a fabricated idea created by colonialists who go places and find some native people and they want to steal everything they have and steal their bodies and enslave them. He's very, very direct about the fact that this is something fabricated in order to keep people down and bring white people to prominence. So I found it was very, very brave of her to be reading these things, very, very bracing. She also had a wonderful spiritual director, a Jesuit. He used to be Cootie McCoon was his name. And he was very different from Flannery. He grew up in the racist South, and he was always like lecturing her about her racial thoughts. And he wrote a memoir in which he talks about the injustice of whites towards African Americans in the South. Like, we rob them of decent schooling, we rob them of decent medicine, we rob them of decent culture, and then we blame them for this. So he had a much more enlightened vision, and she liked surrounding herself with people who she disagreed with. And that kind of, O'Connor loves, as you can tell from the story, she's an inherently dramatic writer. She loves conflict. She loves to bring two immovable forces up against each other and see what happens. And I think that's because she herself always felt as though she was coming up against thoughts, ideas that she couldn't figure out intellectually. She's an artist, and so she would use the stories to kind of work them out. Yeah, but that's also a wonderful question. Yes.
I'm interested in your personal spiritual life. I mean, in terms of your romance, outside of
Every day.
You did all the things that are there.
Yeah, she was a daily communicant. She would wake up in the morning. She would read Preem. Her early prayers in the morning. She and her mother would go to the little church. You could still go to the church in Milledgeville. Basically, the O'Connor family built it. And they would go to mass and sit in the same pew, fifth pew on the right. Then they would come home and they would eat breakfast. And then Flannery would have her a couple of hours for writing, which were sacrosanct. Nobody could bother her during that time. Then she would have lunch with her mother. And then in the afternoon, they would receive visitors. She would paint. Then they would have dinner later on. And then before bed, she would read Compline before bed. Her favorite theologian was Thomas Aquinas, so she would read Thomas Aquinas. And also she read a lot of other theology. She was constantly immersing herself in theology. She would write reviews of books, theological books. One of her favorite writers was Teilhard de Chardin. I don't know if any of you have run into him in any of your classes, but he had some very controversial ideas about evolution at the time. He was in the midst of being silenced by the Vatican. And Flannery was like, she asked her spiritual director, like, can I still read him? Because he's amazing. And he said, yes, it's fine, because he was a Jesuit. It's fine, you can go ahead and read him. But she was fascinated by this idea of, his concept of constant evolution towards, the Perugia that was going to take place. And one of the reasons, she had a lot of reasons for not believing that civil rights was going to solve all of her problems. One of them is theological. She felt like human beings cannot fix what God has to fix. Again, she had this sense of eternity, and that's really the way that it had to happen. But obviously, there are a lot of problems with that with that view. But yeah, she was really quite obsessed with her Catholic faith, even though she could also be. She was simultaneously reverent, but also could be very irreverent. She talks about the fact that we have to suffer as much from the church as we enjoy the benefits that the church gives us. She's very realistic about the flawed nature of the institution of the Catholic Church. But where else are you going to go, right? We're just the way a lot of Catholics feel, right? Yeah. Any other questions?
Can I ask a follow-up question on this, on the spiritual influences? And I sort of alluded to that before we began. She was contemporary with certainly other people, but especially someone like Thomas Merton. So can you just, what was the nature, because they were contemporaries, even though in very different situations. He, of course, was a Trappist and contemplative, but he also was getting into Eastern spirituality. What do we know about the nature of their relationship?
Yeah, Merton was born in 1915. O'Connor was born in 1925, so he was 10 years older than she was. And she was fascinated by him. She enjoyed reading what it was that he wrote. He also enjoyed her work. In fact, one of the most moving eulogies written about O'Connor when she died is he said, when I think of O'Connor, I don't think of other fiction writers like Hemingway. I think of Sophocles. I think of the great Greek tragedians, because she writes, in these large letters about eternity. So Merton admired her tremendously. It's interesting. She read Merton, but he was not one of the mainstays for her in terms of her theological reading. She loved Mardi, for example. She had just certain people that she returned to over and over again. And although she admired Merton, he was not one of them. He probably was too, mucking around in contemporary politics. Probably bothered her a lot. This is one of the reasons she found Dorothy Day irritating, as much as she admired Dorothy Day. There's a very funny story. It's sad, not funny. It's Flannery funny. Flannery O'Connor, Dorothy Day goes down to this interracial farm community, Koinonia, in Georgia, and oh my gosh, this is like very, very bold thing to do, right? To have this farm community, and she goes down to show the Catholic workers support. And of course, the rednecks and probably the local clans takes shots at them. Dorothy, fortunately, was not killed. But Flannery's describing this in a letter to a friend. She says, all my thoughts on this subject are uncharitable. Like, that's a mighty long way to come to get shot at. Because she felt like Northern liberals were messing around in stuff that they had no business messing around in. And again, remember, Flannery is born right on the cusp of Vatican II. So she doesn't get to see the fullness of the church, the Berrigan brothers and Dorothy Day coming into their own with this social justice church. So she's kind of like, why are you people doing all of this? It doesn't make any sense to her. In the same way, the civil rights didn't make any sense to her. The old structures made a kind of sense. And she was enough of a traditionalist to think that there was some strength in those structures, even if they were flawed. But again, I think if she lived past 1964, like she should have, if she lived to 80 years old, she would have become a very different person. Just as any of us, like I shudder to think what I was like when I was 39. I was probably really an idiot. And I want to think about 29 and 19, I mean, it's hopefully we keep getting smarter as we get older, right? It would be depressing if it went the other way. So, so yeah, she had a lot to catch up on, and she didn't get the chance, so there's something poignant about that.
One last follow-up. What was it like to meet Pope Francis?
It was amazing. Yeah, he was so lovely. He was such a genuine person. And the circumstances were I, with some of my colleagues from Georgetown, from the Hank Center, and then in Rome, Father Antonio Spadaro was a Jesuit. We put on this conference on the Catholic imagination in Rome. And because Father Spadaro, who helped us to organize this, was a personal friend of Pope Francis, he told Francis, like, there are these 60 writers are going to be, at the villa in Rome, and Pope Francis said, well, so invite them. That way they should come. So he wrote an address for us in which he talked about the importance of writers, the importance of the imagination. And when we went to the Vatican, we went this, I don't know if you've ever had an audience with the Pope, but like, wow, you go like up staircase, deep into the, like I was astonished at how huge this place is. And you come into this massive, beautiful room where just all of these marble mosaics depicting moments from the Bible and the life of Christ. And I just kept thinking, like, I can't imagine coming to work here every day. Like, what a beautiful place, constantly assaulted by beauty. And then, of course, Francis comes in, and he was hobbling because he hadn't felt well. He canceled all of his audiences the day before because he was not feeling well. He had a fever, but he would not cancel ours. And so he was a little feeble. He came in, but he sat down, and then he read this beautiful address to us in English, in Italian, and we had an English translation that we followed along with. And then he invited each of us up to meet him. That we were given a rosary as a gift. I gave him several copies of a couple of my books. I'm a poet. One of my books, and I deliberately chose this one because I knew he would get a kick out of it because he had such a sense of humor. It's called Saint Sinatra. I wish I had a copy of it here. Where it has Frangelico's Communion of Saints, and then there's Frank's mugshot in the middle. And the title is Saint Sinatra. So I gave him the first book, and then when I gave him that one, he laughed. And so then I just said, thank you, Holy Father. And he said what he says to everybody, pray for me. I'll pray for you, you pray for me. But he was so funny and charming. Another one of my colleagues, writer Liam Callahan, I'm going to call him out on this, he wanted to bring his middle school daughter to Rome, especially after he found out that we were going to meet the Pope. But his principal of her elementary school said, you're not going to Rome. You have final exams that you have to take. You bring me a signed note from the Pope, and you can get out of your final exams. So Liam goes up to the Pope and he says, would you mind writing a note to the principal of my daughter's school? And the Pope, he was laughing. He sat there and wrote the note. So Liam comes away with this note. I can't wait to show this to the principal. So it was, and you could tell he really enjoyed meeting us because we were nobody. We were writers. We weren't big, important dignitaries. We were all told, by the way, the women, we could not wear white because white is the color that the wives of important dignitaries wear. So we had to, we could not do that. So, but it was, it was really, and you could just tell that he really enjoyed it. You know who else was there that day? Martin Scorsese. Oh. And Marty's whole family was there. And he was really moved by meeting the Pope. And the Pope was like, you could tell he had stars in his eyes because he was meeting the great Scorsese. So Scorsese's gift, instead of bringing him a book, was a copy of the Our Father written out in the Osage language because he had just finished the film, The Killers of the Flower Moon, which the Pope was very moved by. And there are always these pictures of them laughing together. It was so charming. So the rest of us have that were at that event always refer to this day as the day we met the two popes. Because then Scorsese came back with us to the villa, and then he gave us this wonderful, like, hour-and-a-half long interview talk about what it's like to be one of the greatest directors in the world at the age of 84 or whatever he was then. And he was inspired that day he said, all my life I've wanted to make a good movie, a good film about Jesus. And all of my films I've made about Christ they're not what I want to do. I'm inspired today. I'm really going to do it this time. So he's working on that film, and we know when it comes out, I bet he dedicates it to Pope Francis because he was so moved by these parents. So, but thank you for asking. It was a great day. Yeah. I miss him. I'm sure we all do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You guys, they always take pictures of the speaker. I like to take pictures of the audience. Thank you. Wonderful. Thanks for being such a great audience. This was
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all coming again, and students can help us put the table and chairs, but you know how they go. Everyone. Have a great
You inspired now, right?
Definitely. Back again over there.
It's 83. That would be crazy.
Calibration, I would say, that's Sicilian, unfortunately. But anyway, I'm a RIT. I was a professor, not in literature, economics, so I didn't know anything about Flannery. After you gave the talk, you said it was for you probably a challenge and a joy. And I mean it this way, that after you finish the talk, questions arose. It's obvious there is just so much that you have learned through your research. And to try to put it into a 1 hour, 50 minutes, or whatever it was, presentation must have been a challenge. Yeah. But then I think it's a joy too to see what the audience who, like me, many of them. I mean, I heard the name, I like Flannery O'Connor, but it wasn't even in the area. So thank you. And the way that you answered the question, the richness of the answer. Every question that you were asked, you gave it your all. You know, you were able to draw. That must have been groundbreaking. How was it received by scholars?
Not a good moment. Besides so let's set off fires. So it was not very. Yeah, so.
Where are we now? I hear that too.
So my students will come in and they'll say, oh,
It's just very.
Very smart man.
I could ask for a million other questions. Folks,
Thank you for asking that question.
Can't think of a better way to spend money.
Oh, thank you so much for coming. It's been a while.
Yeah, I had to remind myself when I see you all the time. Well, we still have places that we can say. A couple of decades earlier, started.
I don't know where he's living.
You know who did, maybe Maya did it. And I also Alice Walker. Alice Walker. Maybe I'm.
You guys are around here.
I don't stay up with you guys. 8:30.
Something.
There was certainly always suspicion of the whoa.
She needed to lose that one.
And also, it's just a biographical thing, but that's a story about her relationship with this text. Yeah, I mean, I knew they got maybe last year.
I had to find myself.
So Flannery
Yeah,
and most of them are about like we send mayonnaise, these people don't know how to make mayonnaise like that. But also this like devotion, even though there was this inseparable bond between them. So, and there's right about as much as we
You know how I always say,
but I always
Yeah, there's a little bit of after pipelines, we will St. John's pipeline.
First Nations, so kind of.
1 year.
We.
Oh, my God.
And actually,
I already know John from
Really?
social media. He had been for years, you know.
Yeah.
That accidentally.
I guess. Usually.
And so, he was talking to Brian, who runs the Women's Center here. I was thinking, like, we have this lecture every year for.
neighbor. I've done various things here.
Yes. Great honest. You guys are big.
Sorry.
Oh, that was so, thank you. That was fun. That was so sad. You don't think Saturday, having the one line.
Can't tell.
I love that old. Sorry.
Okay, we're gonna zip back down.
I'm gonna do a selfie and some red over you. You hopefully brought it, because when you wrote to me, I'll see you tonight, I was thinking. You know, because I'd forgotten that you guys live up here.
anyway.
I was, built back in that.
One of us, yeah.
It's very good.
He's doing some writing, attending conferences, he's actually. He went to Gras Farm with me and took a seminar, and it's like, you know, it's
Right, Father? What's up? Thank you.
So,
I got killed by.
right.